My name is Jim Greer. I'm a professor at the School of Advanced Military Studies for the U.S. Army at Fort Leavenworth. Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. Uh, so for myself, I think that there is a number of islands that have a postmodernist bent. There's certainly a movement within design that has a postmodernist approach to things, but there are also a number of islands that have a modernist bent that are more structured. And I think that myself, I continually move between the two. So I don't see myself on any of those islands. Maybe I'm like on a little raft in between or something. But I pick things from the postmodernist side, things from the modernist side, and try to mix and match them and use whichever one seems to work the best. So said slightly differently, there's a strong conceptual component to design and there's a strong practical component to design, and I try to merge the two. So that's really, I think, what my approach has been over the years. Yeah, I think one of the things that's most important is that the best way to learn design is by doing design. So I would find some place where design is occurring, and there's all sorts of opportunities, whether that's in nonprofits or in corporations or in academia, wherever. But I would find somewhere where design is occurring, and learn by doing. I think that's the most important thing, because design is really all about creation, and there's an active component to that. You have to do it. So I think that's one of the most important things you can do. And then the second thing I think is just read widely. I believe designers of necessity have to have a lot of range, and they have to be a very broad thinker. If you're very narrowly focused on a single discipline or a single function, it's very difficult to be a designer. So the more widely you read, the more different perspectives you have on things, and you become a better designer. But yeah, I think really just active problem solving, and you learn design by doing design. One of the things that we often say about design is to create that which is needed but that does not yet exist. And I really do believe that. There are all these complex problems in the world, uh, both strategically and tactically or locally or regionally. And um, the answers to those problems don't yet exist. And so the job of the designer is to create the solution, even though in many cases no one knows how to go about that. I think the development of the iPhone is a really good example where people didn't know that they needed it, but then once it was produced, then they did need it. So that's I think the simple answer is create that which is needed but does not yet exist. I think one of the things is there's a significant difference between. Well, let me back up a second. One of the things that, again, because I'm a military person, Clausewitz says there's a difference between war on paper and war in the real world. And I think the same thing is true of design. There's a difference between design on the whiteboard and design that actually produces something. Um, just because of my profession, having been in the military and still supporting and enabling the military, I tend to uh, recognize the necessity to be able to go from the whiteboard to the practical, to be able to actually produce something in a military campaign or anything that you're doing. At some point, you have to be able to tell people in the organization, go to this place and do this. So there's a very practical end to it. And I think a number of design uh, thinkers, and I'm not being critical at all because there's a necessity for conceptual design, absolutely. But I think what I bring to the effort is the ability to flow from the conceptual to the practical. There's a tendency, again, in the military design community to think that design is primarily for the design of campaigns or operations or wars, but it has a lot of other uses also. And one of the ones that struck home with me was about a decade ago, where an organization, large organization, was using design uh, to as an aid to suicide prevention, to looking at the challenge of suicide in the military and saying, how can we mitigate this? How can we decrease the number of suicides that we have? And they took a design approach to it. And so they ended up with a very comprehensive solution, a lot of things that could be done. And they did have an impact, at least for a time, on reducing the rate of suicide in the organization. So I think that's um, a way of applying design that's not just for making war, if you will. I will tell you that initiatives like yours about the archipelago um, uh, are to me are very exciting. So the design community, or at least the national security or military focused design community, is expanding, and there's a lot of interest, and it's not just older people like myself, um, but many people who are getting involved in it and coming at it from different directions, and that is exciting. So when the more different people that join our effort and bring different perspectives, whether they're from different countries or they have different disciplines that they're from. That's all very exciting because I think to be a designer, or when you are a designer, by nature you're a learner, and so the more different things that you're learned to or exposed to, the more you learn. And for me, that's very exciting. I mean, learning is always exciting for me. So uh, I think that's the most encouraging thing about our design effort. The other thing that I think is external to the military or the security community, there's more and more design effort uh, across all sorts of disciplines. First it was, um, I think, very commercial. So you had human-centered design for um, building something for sales, and then or you had architectural design or you had interior design, and so all of those ultimately are very commercial, if you will. But design's starting to be used for many more things. So almost every facet of life, there's a design component to it, and that's exciting to me personally, because I can see how what I've learned and what I bring to an organization can be applied not just in a narrow sense, but more broadly. So that's exciting. And then you asked about the upcoming projects. Yeah, I think two. So the first one is I continue to work on how do you develop designers? How do you educate and develop them? Educate in the learning sense, but develop in the experiential sense. And then the second thing is really what's next after design. And there I'm thinking in terms of the military, because we started with a very, uh, again, detailed planning that we would do in our military decision making. And then we moved kind of all the way over to the other end of the spectrum with design, which tends to be very conceptual. And I do think there's something in the middle there. And I'm not sure exactly what that is, but it's something that I work on to try to say, okay, what's next after design? I think for me, design is all about learning. That when we are presented with a complex problem or a very complex environment, we you have to learn about it, and you can't solve or manage complex problems. You can't come up with solutions without learning. So, for me, design is first and foremost a learning effort. So whether that's learning about your current environment, or it's learning in order to think about the future, or it's learning in order to be able to come up with solutions. So, um, I think that that's when I think about design thinking, I just think about more comprehensive learning, better learning. And I think that there are the people that we term natural designers or natural design thinkers are really just natural learners. They're people who are able to, if you drop them down on that proverbial deserted island, they would be able to learn very rapidly and figure out what to do in order to be able to survive and thrive on that island. Conversely, I think if you drop them into the middle of a corporation in Wall Street, they would be able to very rapidly figure out how it works and what the environment is and how whatever they're doing can be done better. And so to me, design thinking is first and foremost about learning. And there was a second half to that question. Common misconceptions, yeah. I think to me, the number one common misconception, at least certainly in the military side of things, is that uh, you have to be really educated to be a designer. It's very, very hard. It's almost some like a combination of the natural sciences and the hard sciences, and you have to read 500 books and know all these really deep theorists. And I don't think anything could be further from the truth. My experience is the best designers usually are young people who haven't read a lot, but are less constrained in their thinking and have maybe accumulated less bias. And also, I think particularly millennials and those before are just naturally systems thinkers, so they see things more in terms of systems. And so you can take any dozen people and create a design team, and they don't all have to have read 18 books by theorists and be exposed to all these very complex, convoluted processes. I think it's not as hard as many people make it out to be, and I think that's the common misperception. Yeah, many. I think. I think the biggest challenge for me was transitioning from the military career to the civilian career. I'd spent 30 years cloistered in one culture, and then leaving that culture and going into a new environment. I mean, that's really hard after 30 years to go into a new environment, and that was difficult for me. And so I think adapting to the new environment and finding my place in that new environment, it took a little while. And to be perfectly honest, I think one of the things is because design was emergent at the time, it was very helpful for me. And I don't mean to apply design to go and do that problem, but rather having all the energy that was around the initiatives that were taking place in design really helped me. For example, the Joint Special Ops University was starting up their design program, and so getting involved in that and being able to kind of latch on to something new. And then my organization that I was in at the time was trying to apply design to an Army that wasn't necessarily sure that it wanted to do that. And so those kinds of activities, as well as on the side, I was actually applying design on the corporate side of things, helped me through that period by keeping me energized, keeping me learning new things, new applications, et cetera. So aside from my two grandkids, my biggest accomplishment, I think, is what those have followed me have done. I'm sufficiently senior that people that I taught or that worked for me and that I helped develop are mid to senior level leaders in the Army now. And a number of them are very successful and they're doing great things. And I'm very proud of that, proud of the role I played in their development. I always say that, the true measure of us is not what we accomplish, but rather what those who follow us accomplish. And so I think that's what I'm most proud of, is the great things that the people who've followed me that have accomplished. And it's good to feel like you had a hand in that. Yeah, that's an interesting one. I think that it's taught me, more than anything, how uh, dynamic life can be, and I think on just all sorts of levels. Certainly we went from normal life, if you want to call it that, pre-COVID to, um, you know, COVID. But even then, within COVID, things were very dynamic and they were changing. As we went from, kind of the fear, what do we do, to the lockdown, to the coming out of the lockdown, to then these perturbations that we have occasionally. So that's one level of dynamism. Another level is in terms of the knowledge and the appreciation for that knowledge has been very dynamic in terms of what we know about COVID when, and then in terms of uh, how that knowledge is proliferated throughout both the country and the world, and how it seems to ebb and flow and turn back in itself sometimes. And so it's extremely dynamic, and I think almost any aspect of COVID that you look at has always been just so dynamic and never just kind of a straight line type of thing. So it's very nonlinear, if you will. I think that's one thing that's taught me. I think the second thing, just as an educator, is that we can, at least at the postgraduate level, educate to a standard, distributed. We don't all have to be in the same room. Although what we have learned is that it's certainly better to be in the same room, but that we can do it distributed. I think we found many things that we can do distributed that we didn't know before. Yeah, so I think that's what I can think of right now.